The banker slid a single sheet of paper across the table and said 3 words. "We need proof." Dale Harmon didn't speak. He reached down, unzipped his canvas bag, and placed a battered green notebook on the table. It was the size of a hardcover novel, held together by a rubber band and 20 years of habit. The cover was stained with field dirt. The corners were soft from handling. The banker looked at it the way you'd look at something that didn't belong in the room. That notebook was either going to save the Harmon farm, or it was going to change nothing. In 1982, the difference between those two outcomes was the difference between staying and losing everything. And the problem was that Dale's son, Gary, the one who had driven them to this meeting, the one who had prepared the financial presentation, the one who was certain they had this handled, had spent the last 3 days telling his father that notebook didn't matter anymore. He was about to find out how wrong he was. To understand what was happening to the Harmon farm in the summer of 1982, you have to understand what was happening to every farm in America at the same time. The Federal Reserve had been raising interest rates since 1979 to kill inflation. By 1981, the prime rate had hit 21.5%. Agricultural lending rates were tracking between 16% and 19%, depending on the institution and the borrower's risk profile. Farmland values had peaked around 1981 and were starting to drop, not slowly, but sharply. In some Midwest counties, land that had been collateralized at $3,000 per acre would be worth $1,200 per acre within 2 years. The mechanism that destroyed farms wasn't just the rates themselves, it was the reset structure. Farmers who had taken variable rate operating loans or had refinanced land purchases at floating rates were exposed to an automatic adjustment cycle. Every 12 months, sometimes every 6, the bank could reassess the loan rate based on current prime plus a margin. A farm that had been paying 9% in 1979 might be staring at 17% by 1982 on the same principle. Monthly payments didn't just increase, they doubled. On a $400,000 land note, that was the difference between a $3,100 monthly payment and a $6,200 monthly payment. The crops hadn't changed, the income hadn't doubled, but the debt service had. The Harmons got their reset notice on a Thursday in June. Gary Harmon was 31 years old in 1982. He had 2 years of community college, a good head for numbers, and the kind of confidence that comes from being right often enough that you stop questioning yourself. He had taken over the day-to-day financials from his father 2 years prior, and he had built out a clean, typed summary of the farm's recent performance. 2 years of yield data, 2 years of expense records, current land valuation estimate, projected revenue for the current growing season. It looked professional, it was organized, he was proud of it. The reset notice changed everything. Their variable rate operating line was adjusting from 11.5% to 16.75%. Their land note was adjusting from 12% to 17.25%. Combined, the monthly debt service was increasing by $1,840. Gary ran the numbers that night at the kitchen table. They didn't clear it. Not with the last 2 years of yields, not even close. Dale sat across from him and said nothing for a long time. Then he got up, went to the back room and came back with the green notebook. Gary looked at it. "We don't need that." Dale set it on the table anyway. "The bank might." "Dad." Gary tapped his typed summary. "This is what banks look at now, clean numbers, organized, not a handwritten journal from 1962. Dale didn't argue, he went to bed. But he left the notebook on the table. The first meeting at First Agricultural Bank of Danville was on a Tuesday morning. The loan officer was a man named Richard Cook, not unkind, but not soft either. He had reviewed 6 farm restructuring requests that week alone. He would review 40 by the end of the month. He had a system, and the system worked from a risk framework, not from relationships. Gary presented the 2-year summary. Yield per acre, 1980 and 1981. Operating costs, breakdown by category, current debt load. Projected 1982 revenue, assuming normal growing conditions. It was clean work. Gary had underlined the key figures. He had brought 3 copies. Cook reviewed it for approximately 4 minutes. Then he asked a question that Gary hadn't prepared for. What does your production history look like before 1980? Gary said he had some records from prior years, but that the recent data was more relevant given current input costs and market conditions. Cook nodded. The problem, he said, is that 1980 and 1981 were both drought years in this region. Your yields are down, which is consistent with the regional numbers. But from an underwriting standpoint, I'm looking at 2 consecutive loss years and asking whether this is a cyclical problem or a structural one. 2 years isn't enough to answer that question. Gary started to explain. Cook held up one hand. Not dismissive, practical. We need historical production records, minimum 10 years, preferably more. If you can show long-term yield stability, that changes the risk profile. If you can't, I have to rate this credit based on what I can see. Gary looked at his father. Dale looked at the wall. Neither of them said anything about the notebook. They drove home mostly in silence. Gary spent the last 10 miles running scenarios. The bank wasn't wrong to ask for historical records. He understood that. The problem was what those records looked like. He knew there had been a bad drought year in 1974. He thought there had been flooding issues in the late 1960s. He couldn't quantify any of it. The farm had operated on memory and instinct for most of its history, and now that history was being called as a witness, and Gary didn't know what it was going to say, his father went straight to the kitchen table. He opened the green notebook to the first page. The first entry was dated April 14, 1962. Corn planting, North Field, 40 acres. Soil condition, fair. Input costs by item. Yield at harvest, 87 bushels per acre. Then a note, dry summer, below average, recovered late season. Gary stood in the doorway and watched his father turn pages. He still thought the notebook was a liability. 20 years of handwritten records, some of them barely legible, numbers scratched in pencil, field maps drawn by hand, weather notes in the margins. Nothing formatted for a bank presentation, nothing that looked professional. He said, Cook isn't going to sit there and read through that. No, Dale said. He kept turning pages. But he's going to look at what it adds up to. That week, Gary started paying attention. He sat down with the notebook for the first time as a financial document rather than a family artifact. What he found was not what he expected. 20 years of entry-level yield records, every field, every crop, every season. Dale had documented drought impact in 1964, 1974, and 1976. He had documented flood delays in 1969 and 1973. He had tracked soil amendments, fallow rotations, equipment failures, and replanting costs. He hadn't done it to impress anyone. He had done it because that was how he managed a farm, by writing down what happened so he could compare it to what happened before. Gary started calculating averages. The 10-year average corn yield from 1970 to 1979 was 112 bushels per acre. The 1980 yield was 91. The 1981 yield was 88. Both were significantly below average, but both were positive. The farm had produced a crop in every single year the notebook documented, including 1974, which had been the worst drought in the region in 3 decades. The 1974 yield had been 79 bushels per acre. Below average, but not a failure. Gary stared at those numbers for a long time. 2 years ago, he had been looking at the farm's recent performance and seeing a problem. Now he was looking at 20 years of performance and seeing something different. Something a banker with a risk framework might call a pattern. He still wasn't sure the notebook would be enough, but he started to understand what his father had been trying to say. On Friday of that week, Cook called Gary directly. He didn't lead with good news. The bank had completed its preliminary risk reassessment. Based on the 2-year performance data submitted, the farm's credit rating had been downgraded from standard agricultural to watch list, 1 tier above substandard. A watch list classification triggered an automatic review of collateral valuation and a mandatory reassessment of repayment capacity before any restructuring could be approved. There was more. The collateral reassessment had come back at a lower land value than the farm had carried on previous appraisals. The bank's internal estimate put current per acre value at 15% below the 1980 appraisal. On 480 acres, that was a significant reduction in the asset base supporting the debt. Gary wrote the numbers down while Cook talked. The loan-to-value ratio had shifted. The debt coverage ratio had shifted. Everything had shifted in the wrong direction, and it had shifted based entirely on 2 years of below-average yields and a land market that was collapsing across the entire region. "We have a second meeting scheduled for the 14th, Cook said. "At that meeting, I need long-term production history, or I can't recommend restructuring. Without a restructuring approval, the loan resets to current rate terms, and we proceed from there." Gary knew what proceed from there meant. It meant default risk. It meant the bank would be looking at the collateral to cover the debt. It meant the farm. He called his father in from the field. Dale sat at the kitchen table and listened to all of it. He didn't get angry. He didn't say he told Gary so. He opened the notebook to the 1974 section and pointed to an entry from August. Yield projection cut by 30%. Drought. Held position, reduced inputs. Recovered $4,800 shortfall by year-end. Farm solvent. Then he turned to 1969. Flooding, Northfield, lost 18 acres of corn. Replanted soy late. Recovered partial. Total loss $2,100. Covered by operating line, farm solvent. Then 1976. Late frost, reduced yields, equipment failure mid-harvest, hired neighbor to assist. Yield down 22%. Farm solvent. Then every year from 1962 to 1981. The bad years and the good years, the recoveries and the setbacks. 20 years of a farm absorbing difficulty and continuing to function. Gary said, "I need to organize this into something the bank can read." Dale nodded. "That's the easy part." Gary spent 3 days building a summary from the notebook. He tabulated every yield by year and by field. He calculated rolling 5-year and 10-year averages. He documented every year where yields had dropped significantly and then showed what the recovery looked like the following season. He wrote out the cost structure for the bad years and showed how the farm had managed cash flow during low-yield periods. What emerged wasn't a story, it was a pattern. The Harmon farm had experienced yield drops in 11 out of 20 years. Drought, flooding, frost, equipment issues, market price fluctuations. In every single one of those years, the farm had remained solvent. The recovery from the bad years was consistent. The average yield, calculated across the full 20-year span, was 109 bushels per acre on corn. The 1980 and 1981 yields, the 2 years the bank had been looking at, were 91 and 88, both below average, but both within the range the farm had experienced multiple times before. Gary's 2-year summary had shown a farm under pressure. The 20-year record showed something completely different. A farm with documented resilience across 2 decades of variable conditions. He typed it all out. He attached the relevant notebook pages as supporting documentation. He prepared a 3-page analysis, cross-referencing the historical data with the current loan structure. Then he sat back and looked at what he had built. The bank had asked for proof. He had proof. The question was whether it was going to be enough. Think about what was happening across the Midwest in 1982. Thousands of farms were in similar positions, variable rate resets, falling land values, 2 or 3 consecutive bad years in a drought cycle. Many of those farms were trying to negotiate restructuring with their banks. Many of them failed. Not because the farms weren't viable, not because the farmers weren't capable, but because they couldn't prove viability. They had no documentation, no records, no pattern, just memory and assurances, and banks don't fund assurances. A farm that had been averaging 105 bushels per acre for 15 years and had 2 bad years at 88 bushels was not in the same risk category as a farm that had genuinely been failing for a decade. But if all you had was 2 years of data, there was no way to make that distinction. The bank had no choice but to rate the credit based on what it could see, and what it could see looked like structural decline. The notebook was not a sentimental object, it was a financial record. And in 1982, financial records were the difference between staying and losing. Would 2 bad years define you? That was the question hundreds of farm families were asking that summer. For most of them, the answer depended entirely on whether they had data to prove otherwise. The second meeting with Cook was on the 14th. Gary brought 3 copies of the summary, the notebook, and his father. Dale sat across from Cook and said very little. Gary presented the analysis. He walked Cook through the 20-year yield record, the rolling averages, the recovery data from prior drought years. He showed the 1974 and 1976 comparables. He showed that the farm's current yield performance was consistent with previous below-average years, each of which had been followed by recovery. Cook listened without interrupting. When Gary finished, Cook asked to see the notebook. Dale slid it across the table. The room was quiet for a while, not uncomfortable, just the sound of pages turning. Cook was not reading every entry. He was sampling. He was looking at the years Gary had flagged. He was comparing the handwritten records to the typed summary to confirm they matched. Gary watched him and tried to read the expression on his face. He couldn't. After several minutes, Cook closed the notebook and set it on the table. "Your 10-year corn average comes out to 109 bushels, he said. "Yes," Gary said, "and your last 2 years are 91 and 88. Correct." Cook wrote something on his notepad. "That's a cyclical variance, not a structural decline. The 1974 and 1976 years show comparable dips and recovery." Gary said nothing. He waited. Cook looked at Dale. "You've maintained these records since 1962. "Yes," Dale said, every season. Cook nodded slowly. He turned back to Gary. "I'm going to recommend a risk reclassification, from watch list back to standard agricultural. That changes the restructuring terms." Gary felt something release in his chest that had been tight for 3 weeks. "A reclassification allows us to offer a restructured note," Cook continued. "Extended term, fixed rate for 3 years, with a rate cap on variable periods thereafter. The payment comes down to something the farm can service on historical yield averages." He slid a preliminary term sheet across the table. "This isn't final, it goes to the loan committee, but based on what I'm looking at, I'll recommend approval." The restructuring was approved 11 days later. The fixed rate for the first 3 years came in at 14.5%, still high, but manageable against the farm's documented production capacity. The monthly debt service dropped back into range. The collateral reassessment held a reduced value, but because the risk classification had improved, the loan-to-value threshold was evaluated differently under the restructured terms. The farm survived. Not because the Harmons gave a speech, not because they appealed to the bankers' sympathy or invoked family history or talked about how many years they'd worked the land. They survived because they had 20 years of documented performance that proved what 2 bad years could not disprove. The farm was viable. Dale took the notebook home and put it back in the canvas bag. He put the bag back where he kept it, in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the back room. Gary sat at the kitchen table that evening and thought about the presentation he had been so confident about. The clean, typed 2-year summary. It had looked professional. It had been accurate, and it had been on its own almost enough to lose the farm. Not because it was wrong. Because it was incomplete. Because 2 years is not the same thing as 20 years. And no amount of formatting closes that gap. He thought about the farms in the county that hadn't made it. Some of them had been good operations. Some of them had probably had similar histories to the Harmon farm, but they hadn't had the records to prove it. The bank doesn't fund stories. It funds patterns. And you can't build a pattern from 2 data points, no matter how clean they look on paper. There's a practical lesson inside this story that gets missed if you focus on the wrong thing. In agricultural lending, repayment capacity is not the same as collateral. A bank can foreclose on land, but what it wants, what makes a loan viable, is the documented ability to generate cash flow that services debt over time. Collateral is the backup. Repayment capacity is the primary credit. To assess repayment capacity in agriculture, lenders look at yield history across multiple years and weather cycles. A 10-year average smooths out the noise of individual drought or flood years. It shows whether a farm is structurally productive or cyclically stressed. Those are not the same thing. In 1982, many banks were under pressure from regulators to tighten agricultural credit. They were being asked to prove that their farm loan portfolios were sound. That meant downgrading credits that showed risk. A farm with 2 bad years and no historical record looked risky. A farm with 2 bad years and 20 years of documented stability looked cyclical. The difference wasn't the farm, the difference was the data. Gary's 2-year summary showed risk. Dale's 20-year notebook showed pattern. And in a banking environment that was terrified of agricultural exposure, pattern was the only thing that could override a recent loss record. 2 years is noise, 20 years is data. Losses tell one story, history tells another. The Harmons planted their 1982 crop in late spring, a few weeks after the restructuring was finalized. Normal yields would return by 1984. The drought cycle broke, the land values in their county stabilized by 1986 and began recovering slowly by the late 1980s. Dale kept writing in the notebook. New entries, same format, yield per acre, input costs, weather notes, field conditions. He never called it important. He never explained why he did it. He just kept doing it because it was how he managed the operation and because he believed that knowing what had happened before was the only way to understand what was happening now. Gary started keeping his own records. More structured than his father's, typed and categorized. But he kept them. When his own son started working the farm in the mid-1990s, Gary gave him a box of files and a piece of advice. Not about farming, not about finance. Just this: document everything every year without gaps, not because you think you'll need it, because the moment you need it and don't have it, there's nothing you can do. The farm is still operating. The notebook is still in the canvas bag, in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the back room. It has more entries now, 40+ years of them. Some seasons good, some bad, all of them written down. In the summer of 1982, when everyone was wondering which farms were going to make it and which ones weren't, the answer came down to one thing: who could prove what they claimed to be true? The Harmons could prove it. They laughed at the notebook. The bank used it to measure survival. If you found this story useful, the history, the finance, or the lesson inside it, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories like this one.